Hello, my name's Declan Dempsey. I'm speaking on the 1st of July. I'm a barrister from Cloisters Chambers, and this is the third talk in a series of talks designed to help people stem the upsurge in race discrimination that has occurred since the referendum on whether or not the UK leaves the European Union. This talk is going to deal with when a public body exercising a public function is discriminating. So we'll look at what a public authority is, what a public function is. We'll talk about Section 29 of the Equality Act. I will briefly mention in the context of these things direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, but we'll talk about Section 26, harassment, and Section 27, victimisation. Schedule 28 of the Equality Act says that public function is defined twice in the Act, but in each case it refers to the definition in the Human Rights Act 1998. In very broad terms, the public authority includes any person, certain of whose functions are functions of a public nature. There are various exclusions. It doesn't include the House of Parliament or persons exercising functions in connection with proceedings in Parliament, but it will include all local authorities and all those bodies established by statute or royal charter who carry out a state function, for example taxation, policing, health services and so forth. Contracting out does not remove the public nature of these kinds of duties or operations, so that a private person who's carrying out a essentially state function is also going to be covered and is going to be conducting acts of a public nature. So in other words, this section will cover them. The section in question is Section 29. It's couched initially in the provision of services to the public. A person concerned with the provision of a service to the public or a section of the public, for payment or not, must not discriminate against a person requiring the service by not providing the person with the service. So the section then goes on to deal with when the types of things that the service provider must not do. So, for example, there must be no discrimination, so that's either direct discrimination under Section 13 or indirect discrimination under Section 19 against a person as to the terms on which the first provides the service to the second, or by terminating the provision of the service to the member of the public or section of the public. In essence, a service provider includes someone who provides a public function, and in the Equality and Human Rights Commission's statutory code on Section 29, you'll see references to service provider, and you'll see very few references to those providing public functions. This is because, in essence, the law is the same relating to both of them. However, it's important to note that even if what a local authority is doing can't be categorised as provision of a public function, it's still going to be covered by the fact that it's a service provider within the definition of this term. So, in essence, you can argue to the local authority that it's either covered as a provider of public functions or it's covered by the Act but as a service provider. The third way in which a person can discriminate is by subjecting the public or a member of the public to a detriment. And in the context of service provision or public function provision by employees of a service provider or a public function, that may be quite important if, because of, for example, an employee's racist views, they subject a member of the public or a member of a section of the public to a detriment. So that basically means anything that an ordinary person would regard as a detriment. Service providers also must not harass either a person requiring the service or a person to whom the service provider does provide the service. And they mustn't victimise. So they mustn't victimise a person, again in these three ways, as to the terms, by terminating the provision of the service, or subjecting that other person to any other detriment. Section 29.6 is the one that deals explicitly with these public authorities, with the exercise of a public function. And you can see that what it says is that a person must not, in the exercise of a public function, that is not a provision of a service to the public or a section of the public, do anything that constitutes discrimination. So that's section 13, direct discrimination, treating somebody less favourably because of race, or section 19, so that is applying something that looks neutral but actually disadvantages a racial group and disadvantages the individual, and which cannot be justified as a proportionate way of achieving a legitimate aim. So they mustn't do anything that constitutes discrimination in those senses, or harassment in the sense that we're about to look at, or victimisation. Harassment's dealt with under section 26, and essentially what it means is that person A engages in unwanted conduct related to race, and the conduct has the purpose or the effect of violating the recipient's dignity, or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for the recipient. Now, that's the part of this section that deals primarily with race. There are other parts that you can see on the slide that deal with sexual harassment, but in all of these cases, if you're trying to decide whether the conduct has the effect of violating the recipient's dignity or creating that intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for the recipient, then you look at how the recipient perceives the conduct, you look at all the circumstances, and you would decide whether it's reasonable for the conduct to have that intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive effect. I mentioned victimisation, and this may be of use if you find yourself in a situation in which you've asserted that an act of discrimination is going on and essentially you've been punished for it. So a person victimises another person if they subject that other person to a detriment because that other person has done a protected act, or they believe that the other person has done or may do a protected act. So a protected act is the bringing of proceedings, but it also includes giving information or evidence, or doing any other thing for the purposes of or in connection with the Equality Act 2010. So for example, if you bring to the attention of the local councillor or the local council that they may be acting in breach of their duty to have due regard to promote or foster good race relations, and they're simply not doing anything about the graffiti that exists in the local neighbourhood, and you get punished in some way for having done that, then you may be able to complain to them, to the council, and ultimately to the courts that you are being victimised. You can see there that the protected act includes making an allegation, and it doesn't have to be an express one, that somebody, it could be the person who punishes you or another person, has contravened the Equality Act. But you should note that giving false evidence or information or making a false allegation isn't protected if, and only if, the information or allegation is given or made in bad faith. So I want to say some words in conclusion. If you want to do something about the surge in racism and want to influence local authorities, police authorities and the like, you should consider writing to them about what their response is to the upsurge of racist abuse, attacks and any graffiti you've noted in your area. In the previous talk I talked about the public sector equality duty, the duty to have due regard to eliminate unlawful discrimination happening, but also the duty to foster good relations between persons of different racial groups. So you should be asking them now what they are doing about it. You should suggest to them the steps that they could take to do something about it. If you see an act of unlawful discrimination being permitted by the local authority, you can help to tackle the unlawful discrimination and harassment by public authorities. And you're most likely to see this if local authority employees are acting in a way which is harassing service users or behaving in an unacceptable way. So it includes tackling the local authority over the behaviour of their employees. They are responsible for the behaviour of their employees, which is carried out in the course of their duties. This is obviously because there should be no place for racial harassment of service users by staff of public bodies. And of course the public bodies have got the public sector equality duty, and they should be seeking to eradicate this type of behaviour. Council has also got a duty under Section 26 of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015. This is a duty to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. They therefore have got a duty to watch out for non-violent extremism, which has the risk of leading to acts of politically motivated violence. Now, the government has issued guidance on the application of this. It talks about a definition of extremism in its prevent strategy. It is vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, which include democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs.